Hello, and thanks for sticking it out with us over the last 5 weeks as we've been looking at various enemies of the heart and how we can guard ourselves from them. In a sermon on Sunday, Pastor Mike shared an awesome quote. It was, "If you don't deal with the demons, they go into the cellar of your soul and lift weights." Things like guilt and anger and jealousy and greed, when they get into your heart, they don't just go away on their own. If you don't do something about them, they will grow stronger. And while you might be able to hide them for a while, eventually they will show up in your life and they will ruin things. This whole series has been about practices that are meant to help us keep those heart enemies from going into the cellar of our souls and lifting weights. And today we're shifting gears just a little bit to talk about an enemy of the heart, not only that has the potential to ruin our relationships with others, but if we don't deal with it, it keeps us from helping others fight their own enemies of the heart. What we're talking about today is indifference. Now, indifference, it's the idea that your enemies of the heart are not my problem. I am responsible to deal with my issues, and you are responsible to deal with your issues, and your issues are just not any of my concern. Now, this makes a lot of sense in our culture because we live in an individualistic world where we tend to emphasize the need for personal responsibility. If there's something wrong in my life, it's my responsibility to deal with it. And there's something wrong in your life, then it's just not my problem. Well, Jesus has some words that encourage us in a slightly different direction. And we find these words in Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 8. He says, "If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands and 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell." Now, obviously, Jesus doesn't want you to go home from this study and chop off your arm or gouge out your eyes, but his point is this: when there is sin in your life, it is so serious of an issue that these extreme measures really aren't that extreme in comparison to the destruction that sin tends to bring. Sin needs to be destroyed in your life, and we need to be willing to do hard things to destroy it, or else it might destroy us. There is an old dead theologian named John Owen who once wrote, "Be killing sin, or it will be killing you." And this has been the point of this whole series. We need to guard our hearts against the things that can ruin our relationship with God and with others. But how is this related to indifference? Well, if we skip ahead a few verses, Jesus says this: "If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the 2 of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they'll not listen to you, take 1 or 2 others along so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or tax collector." Now, don't miss how these 2 passages work together. Sin is so serious that if it's present in your life, it's worth cutting your hand or gouging your eye out to get rid of. Now, if it's that serious, and we see it in our fellow Christians' life, shouldn't we have a conversation with them to make sure that they see it and are working on it? A few years back, I left my headlights on in my car. I had an old, busted up car that didn't have automatic headlights, and I was in such a hurry to get home and get inside that I forgot to turn them off. Well, at like 11 p.m., I heard a knock on my door, and I was already in bed, so I put my clothes on and went down to see who it was, and it was my neighbor. He was worried that I didn't know my car lights were on, so he did the incredibly awkward thing and knocked on my door at 11 p.m. to tell me so that I could deal with it and not face the hard situation of a dead car battery at 6 a.m. when Meredith was trying to leave for work. He knew that he had to do something awkward to keep me from facing an even harder situation. That's like Jesus is teaching here. Jesus knows that sin destroys, and he knows that sometimes we don't realize the sin in our own life, and we need other people to do that awkward thing that thing like knocking on our door and saying, hey, did you see this in your life? Now, with each of the enemies of the heart we've been talking about how they hurt us and others and our relationship with God, and it's easy to see how indifference might end up damaging others around us. But there's something else that happens with indifference. When we purposefully excuse ourselves from other people's lives, it tends to cultivate a sense that we really don't need to care about the actions and outcomes of other people. Right between the two passages of Scripture that we just read, Jesus says these words, "What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hill and go and look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he is happier about the one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off." Now the point of that is simple. God cares deeply about every person and about the outcome of their lives, and He doesn't want to see sin destroy anyone. The implication? If we're following Jesus and trying to live out the values of God, we should also care deeply about every person and the outcomes of their lives, which means we do need to actively fight against indifference in our life, because indifference and an attitude of self-sacrificial love for neighbor are mutually exclusive. So, how do we fight indifference? Well, we do it through occasionally practicing compassionate confrontation. In verse 15 of our passage, Jesus says, "If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over." This is the first step in compassionate confrontation. When you see an enemy of the heart raise its head in a fellow Christian's life, find a way to talk about it. Talk with them personally about it, and in a way that's compassionate and desires to understand. Say, hey, this is hard to talk about, but I saw this happen the other day, and I wanted to ask if you noticed that and what you thought about it. If it goes well and they say, I know I'm really struggling with this, well, that's a victory. You can pray together and talk through the issue and maybe create a plan to help each other. But if they reject your efforts to confront that enemy of the heart, then that brings us to step 2 of compassionate confrontation. Jesus explains step 2 like this: "But if they'll not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." This is the idea of taking a few other Christians who have seen this enemy of the heart in a person's life and trying again. If the person still doesn't believe you or won't listen to you, maybe they'll listen to a few others who have seen it as well. And finally, if that doesn't work, we have step 3, which Jesus says, if they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. This is an uncomfortable passage, and it's such a hard concept that requires more discussion than we can do in this setting. But like Pastor Mike said in his sermon, it's important to understand in this that the motivation is not about punishment. Instead, it's about protection. You see, sin doesn't just impact the individual who's involved in it. No, it also impacts everyone who their life touches. Sin won't just bring extreme consequences to bear on the life of the person who is sinning. It will bring them to bear on the lives of others. Oftentimes, others who are innocent. And so when someone is removed from the community, it should always be a case where it's clearly over sin, and that sin is seen clearly by the whole community. And the person engaged in that sin has refused multiple times to own it and address it. And so now that sin is being addressed because there is a responsibility to protect the innocent from the guilty and the impact their sin will have on others. Indifference, it fails to protect others from sin, and it does damage to our hearts because it creates a sense of apathy rather than love. So hear the teaching of Jesus and practice biblical confrontation when you need to. I hope your discussion on this is fruitful and can be encouraging, and we just want to say thanks again for joining us during this study, and we will see you soon.